questions from the audience? All right. This is a sociologist, Phil Zuckerman, who's done a sociological study of Denmark and Sweden and the level of secularism there. He writes, if there is an earthly heaven for secular folk, contemporary Denmark and Sweden may very well be it. Quaint towns, inviting cities, beautiful forests, healthy democracies, among the lowest violent crime rates in the world, the lowest levels of corruption in the world, excellent educational systems, clean hospitals, of course, delicious beer, free healthcare, egalitarian social policies, and not much faith in God. I am not asking any of you to draw on your expertise of Scandinavian societies. But I am curious to know, is religious faith, according to Zuckerman, is he right? Is it unnecessary for a healthy, prosperous, and deeply moral society? Do you think, bring this more closer to home to the United States, do you think that the pervasiveness of religion and the widespread belief in God here in the United States makes this country a more or a less generous society?
I will note, to start with, that there's clearly a flaw in This is Paradise. If you've been to Denmark or Sweden, the beer is highly expensive. So there are a couple thoughts here. They're perhaps not terribly deep or not necessarily connected. I think that there is no necessary relationship between religion and a generous or ungenerous society. I think very much it depends on the form that religion takes. And I'm also, I think the perhaps greater question I'm wondering about is, heaven for secular folk is happiness. And is the relationship between happiness and religious sentiment of whatever particular dogma or lack thereof happens to have? And there I think there might be. And so for Denmark and Sweden, I don't know enough. I don't know the stories they tell themselves. I don't know the sense, the narratives they shape of their lives and how they see their connections with each other. And I don't have a sense of the happiness quotient, where Nepal wanting to quantify happiness as an extent of national well-being. I don't know how Sweden and Denmark stack up on that. It looks pretty good from here, but I haven't been there. And so I'm not sure then, it turns out they're telling themselves wonderful stories and finding lots of meaning in their lives, then while they may not be orthodox, I'm not sure they are a-religious.
Okay. I have nothing to say about this question, so I'll just continue with the last question. You have to know, Storm and I have this conversation going, I call the conversation going on and on and on. It's sort of an ongoing debate. And if you go down to Ockham House, you'll see there are chips on the walls, and it's shows, right? But I'm not going to start agreeing with him just because you're here. Michael Roos said that is a biological artifact, an artifact of our biology. He's absolutely right about that. You know, have you ever noticed, I've always been interested by this fact, that inanimate things don't value. That is to say, valuation is something that living systems do. I mean, a block of ice doesn't care if it's gas or liquid or solid. The laces on your shoes don't care if they're tied or untied. Inanimate things don't engage in valuation. Only living things, and all living things, engage in valuation. That should tell us something. It tells me then that value and valuation is a property of living systems. And it's not much further on down the line, a little bit, but not much further on down the line, say that values are then relative to life. If living things are the, and of course, if you're a theist, you will say, and with no argument from me, that God values, okay? I leave God out of it, and I look around the world, and I see that the only things that do valuing are living things. And so I reached the conclusion that value, all valuing, is relative to life. So life comes out as a kind of absolute value. That's not much of an argument, and as I said before, this is a faith statement that that life is good. But once we say life is good, then we turn it over to the rational process that Storm was talking about. Now about this. What's your question? Yeah, well, it's an empirical question, isn't it? It seems to me it's an empirical question. If, in fact, we can find a way to measure religious devotion or religiosity or whatever it is that religiousness refers to, if we can find a way to measure the intensity or the level of religious fervor, and if we can find a way to measure what's being referred to here as some kind of moral health or social functionality, a healthy society, if we can figure out how to measure that, then it seems to me that we should be able to, get on the road and find out what the correlation is between them, and we'd have our answer. It's an empirical question, okay? The trouble is that deciding what is moral dysfunction and what is moral health is really difficult because those notions are loaded with all kinds of variables, right? And you know what to do with variables. You scratch your head over them. And it's also the case that religious fervor or religiosity or religious devotion, whatever we're using, that too is loaded with all kinds of variables. And so social science research on religion and society is fraught with all kinds of difficulties. And so we don't have much really good, solid evidence to bring to bear on this, in principle, empirical question. The best, unfortunately, the best social science research we do have at the moment, and this goes back to a study that was done about 5 years ago, with a fairly large sample, drawn from a variety of information sources. The best research to date shows that the correlation between religiosity and social functioning or social moral health is not a positive correlation. And that goes against our intuitions, because we want to say that religious traditions, when they're at their best, make us more moral. But in fact, when you look at this broad spectrum of data, what you see is that the least religious people, I'm talking about Japan and Norway and the Netherlands, the least religious people have the lowest rates of murder, lowest rates of teen pregnancy, lowest rates of spouse abuse, lowest rates of all the nasty behavior. And so it looks like a counterintuitive correlation that the more religious you are, the more, dysfunctional you are. That's what the data shows. But again, that, full of holes, because there's so many different variables that when it comes to social science studies of religion, you really have to be skeptical because it's so variable that we hardly know how to measure what we think we understand.
If anything is in principle a social science question, then it is necessarily not a moral question. It may be relevant to a moral question, but it's not a moral question. That's the difference between what's descriptive and what's truly normal. If it's a social science matter, what makes us happy, or a biological matter, what makes us survive, that doesn't tell us anything about morality unless we know that happiness or survival are good things. And those are not discoverable by empirical discipline. What the good is not an empirical question. Which is why, even if being a living thing is a necessary condition for being a valuer, that doesn't tell us anything about what's valuable intrinsically or about what the object of value is. It certainly doesn't tell us that life is valuable. In fact, it may be the case, I think it's the case, that it is better to be dead than to be certain ways. I think that's true individually, and I actually think that's true of the whole species. It would be better not to exist than to exist in certain ways. That's what I have to say about the biological debate, about the disjunction between biology and ethics. I didn't start college till pretty late in life, later than most folks do. So when I maybe should have been in college, I went to Sweden. I was a roadie in a Jesus rock band. And it was all of these things there. I mean, this was a long time ago, actually, but it was all of these things. And these things are all very great. I mean, I would absolutely like for us to have them all. I like them all. Well, except for not much faith in God. But that's the part that they say is different. But teenagers were killing themselves like flies there. I mean, really. I mean, it was. I hope it's not still that way. I confess to my shame. I don't know how it is nowadays. But at the time, man, like I say, I came over there with a bunch of rock and roll Jesus freaks. They invited us to high schools. Why? And like, these people have all of this, and they're dying. They're killing themselves. So, at this point, I don't really have anything to say about morality. As I kind of agree with what Eric has said, and to some extent what Loyal has said about, look, I don't know anything about the correlation. That is an empirical question, the correlation between happiness or generosity and these certain sorts of social arrangements and what the role of religion is there. And I guess I don't really have anything to say about ethics about that either, right? I mean, I'm going to say something about religion here. That is to say, we find ourselves facing circumstances in our lives and our relationships with each other that push us to the deepest possible sense to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be me and you? And how can my life be the way that it is? And how am I supposed to think about this? And that kind of question, that circumstance, there's all kinds of psychological sort of relevant features of that thing, and there's moral features of that thing, and there's sociological ones and stuff that has to do with society, and there's religious ones in a certain sort of way. But in the end, at least some of those questions are resolved by asking ourselves what is true, ultimately, about the nature of persons and the world. And to me, as difficult, as impossible as it is to answer that question at this point with any level of certainty, it is the most important question that there is. and is the most important religious question.